Good evening. My name is Margarita Mooney. I am the founder and executive director of Scala Foundation. I'm also a professor in the Department of Practical Theology at Princeton Theological Seminary. And it's my pleasure to welcome you tonight to this webinar with the Japanese-American artist Makoto Fujimora, where we will talk about his book, Art and Faith, A Theology of Making. But before we get started, I see some of you are introducing yourself in the chat button. That's wonderful. We'd like to know your name, where you're joining us from. And this conversation we're going to have tonight, I just wanted to explain where this fits in briefly with my trajectory. And I also want to thank the co-sponsors of this event, the Catholic Studies program at the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul. I began to be interested in aesthetics really through some of my work on suffering and resilience. And I saw that people who had experienced trauma also had really powerful experiences of beauty. And I'd only really read about this, for example, in the memoir of Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning, where he talks about the piercing beauty that he experienced in Nazi concentration camps and how that influenced his understanding of human psychology and the human good. So through my work, I've begun teaching at Princeton Theological Seminary on this topic of aesthetics and beauty in trying to relate that to really practical ways of living in the world, worshiping God, and also how we educate people, how we educate our minds. And I did a lot of research on the topic of beauty and aesthetics, and it tends to get very philosophical and very theological and somewhat abstract. But this spring, I wanted to bring to you a couple of artists, a couple of people who make beautiful things in the world and can also speak eloquently about philosophy, theology, and their own faith. So I'm so delighted tonight to actually meet I was going to say in person, but meet for the first time our guest speaker, Makoto Fujimora, who I have heard about from so many friends, who I've seen as a senior fellow of the Trinity Forum. I saw him at a Rivendell Institute talk in New Haven, all online. And I am so pleased that he has agreed to join the beginning of my spring class on aesthetics and Christian education, as well as the Scala, as well as a Scala webinar aiming at educating our beautiful minds. So Mako, as I understand, all of our mutual friends call you Mako. I wonder, would you just tell our audience briefly tell us a little about your biography? I know you were born and raised both in the United States and Japan and studied in both places. So if you could tell us a little bit about your background and how you came to be an artist and a Christian.
Yeah. So I was born in Boston. My father is a well-known research scientist, a pioneer in acoustics and speech and hearing sciences. When I was born in Boston, he was doing his postdoc with Noam Chomsky. So he took generative grammar theory eventually to Japan, but we went by Sweden. I spent 2 years in Sweden. My first visual memory is in Sweden, and then to Japan, where I went to grade school. And then high school, middle school, high school in New Jersey. I was back in US. My father was recruited by Bell Labs, the premier Pew Research Institute at the time. And so my journey is back and forth, cross-cultural, certainly cross bilingual, but the reality is I find myself incredulous that I'm writing these books because I struggle so much with language, both Japanese and English. So I became a visual artist, right, to be able to bridge the gap there. But I had an inkling from very early on. My mother kept a painting that I did when I was in Sweden. I must have been 2.5 or 3. And she framed it, and gave it to me for graduation from Bucknell University, where I went as undergrad. And basically didn't say too much, except that, she saw my gifts early on and nurtured that all along. it's a painting that I have reframed, and I put it in my living room. I walk past it every time I come here to the studio in Princeton, because it reminds me of when I, when you don't have an ego, or you're not showing off anything to anybody. Your expressions are pure, and it's exactly the same colors and lines that I use today, and yet there's something deeper there that hopefully today, in my most sophisticated naivete, I can draw back on. So I knew I was an artist. I just didn't know what that meant. And as I describe in my new book, Art and Faith, Theology of Making, I was drawn into faith through my creative interactions, where I felt really the Spirit inviting me to feel. Whenever I painted, I felt the presence of God. I didn't know what to call that. I thought everybody had this experience, until I went to middle school and found out that would be quite an odd thing to talk about. But it was very visceral and real to me throughout my life, and I didn't have language for this. But in college, I began to read authors and poets like William Blake, or certainly Shakespeare and Milton, and I began to understand that there's a biblical origin in terms of creative imagination, and especially in Western literature, that's certainly something that I needed to understand. So I began to read the Bible through literature, and then eventually I ended up William Blake's last epic poem called Jerusalem, which is 400 pages long. But I waded through several times, and at the end there is an amazing passage that Blake's emanation, Albion, is literally in front of Jesus at the cross. And Albion says, "Lord, what can I do? My self-willed cruel marches against thee, deceitful to meet thee in its pride." This poetry of confession. And then Jesus answers, "Fear not, Albion, unless I die, thou cannot live. And wouldest thou love one who never died for thee, or or ever love one who has not died for thee? And if God died not for man, man cannot exist, for God is love, and man is love. And every act of kindness is but a little death in the divine image." So when I read that, I was taken by this reality of Jesus, and it's utterly consistent with the Gospel of John, what he speaks, the language, the tone, and I fell in love with Jesus. At that point, I didn't know that I had become a Christian in any sense of that word. I even resisted for about a year, arguing my friends who were missionaries, convincing them that I was not a Christian in so many ways. And they kept on asking, so do you believe that Jesus was the Son of God? And I said, well, yeah. I mean, who else could say those things in such beautiful ways to define love in a way that I have been searching for? And they said, do you believe in the resurrection? And I said, of course. I mean, if Jesus was God, why wouldn't he resurrect? And is that a full body resurrection? They kept on going, right, guys? I kept on saying, why wouldn't you believe that? Like if Jesus gave his life for us to define this love, and in a way that we were created for, that creation begs this question, the gap between what we know to be true about ourselves and what we see and in ourselves and in the world, then if Jesus came to bridge that gap, of course he had to show forth historically, bodily, that reality. So I would go into these arguments, and they were like, you're a Christian.
Yeah, I was going to ask you why you were at that point you weren't.
And I kept on saying, no. I have all sorts of problems with the church. I have this, I have that, I have this. And so, but then eventually I realized, like, oh, okay, so I am a Christian. Oh no, now what? So.
So fascinating, because I mean, I'm sure you hear this all the time, but for so many of us, myself included, my understanding and my imagination of Christianity in Japan has been so influenced by the novel Silence,
yes,
which was a book that you yourself have written an entire meditation on.
That's right.
And also that you do art, because a big part of the book Silence, if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. There was also a movie. You should read Mako's book about it. But it's a story that tells of the persecution of Christians in Japan. And part of the persecution was the emperor forcing them to stamp on icons. And so again, that all shows the importance of what I want you to help us understand tonight is the nexus of culture and a fullness of humanity, a flourishing of humanity in culture and art, and tying that to faith. But faith, as you described it, as a journey of yourself, looking into yourself, creating things in the world, and making connections about truth and about knowledge. And so it's just so interesting to see your journey and how you came to do the art that you do and also explain it. But it sounds to me like you were making beautiful things while you were searching for a tradition or a way of thinking that would help you make the connections that you were trying to make. Is that?
Trying to certainly, but Japanese history is rather interesting and complex, and Shusa Gendo's novel Silence captures some of that, and it's often misread because it people think, well, it's about a apostate priest and how you lose your faith under persecution, but it's really the opposite of that. That's what I talk about in the book. Endo was talking about a cultural condition which traditional faith structures, institutional faith, cannot survive, and yet his whole point was that personal faith can survive through that somehow, mysteriously and powerfully. And so Silence is an excruciatingly difficult book for a Christian to read. And yet the nuggets of it, I think Martin Scorsese captures in the film well, is that faith can survive. And in fact, our faith today is more like the faith of hidden Christians in 17th century Japan than it is ever broadcasted to be, as evangelical church pretends that it is. And I think we see the fractures exposed in the past years that show how the faith needs to be tested in some way in order to be purified and in order to be discerned from false fruits to something that is real and that can survive persecutions. Japanese history, as you know, is a very fractured and difficult history for Christians, and it is not certainly a place that you would expect somebody like me to gain faith. And yet I believe, as I write in my books, that Japanese culture is not a pagan culture, but it is a hidden Christian culture. And therefore, there is a lot of things, including what I talk about in my new book, which is kintsugi, right? This venerable art of tradition of tea that mends broken bowls with Japan lacquer and gold, and making the resulting bowl more beautiful and more valuable than the original. When I was in Japan, one of the steps of coming to faith, being awakened in faith, was the painting of George Rouault, which Japanese, for some reason, have collected the best Rouault paintings. And Rouault, as you know, is Jack Maritain's friend, and it was George Rouault that really convinced Maritain of his faith, and Raisa as well. And this relationship between a philosopher and an artist is a fascinating story, and one that, Creative Intuition book captures. That book was written as a way to communicate with George Rouault, who an artist. How do you value intuitive knowledge? And Maritain's premise is that intuitive knowledge is not separate from rational. In fact, rational flows out of the intuitive, and it's not, it's not left brain, right brain. It's really about flow of something that is beautiful, transcendent, that is drawn out of us into rational knowledge. So that argument, the funny thing about this is that I didn't know this relationship until I wrote my book, Silence and Beauty. That, while I was arguing for what Maritain argues for, I was doing research, and I realized that, oh my goodness, he wrote this to George Rouault. And then what happened was, at Bucknell, as an undergrad, there was this huge book table where Creative Intuition was there, and I picked it up, I bought it, and I have been carrying this book ever since my undergraduate years, pre-Christian, years. I brought it to Japan with me. I was reading it. And then I went to see Rouault exhibit in one of the Idemitsu Museum in Tokyo. And they have one of the best selection of passion paintings that he did, that actually the Rouault estate collected for actually a very interesting history, which I won't go into, but it ended up in Japan. And I'm standing in front of these paintings of Jesus's path toward crucifixion and beyond. And I'm profoundly influenced by them, even though I did not understand the story fully. So intuitively, I was, as C.S. Lewis says, that my imagination was baptized before I was. And I became immersed in this conversation of Maritain and Rouault, complete from philosophical end with Maritain, because I didn't know they were, friends. But later on, when I was writing on Endo, I realized, Endo being a Catholic writer, Maritain had a significant influence on Endo, because his best friend studied under Maritain in Paris. So this was a philosophical link that I had to learn more about. So while I was doing that research, I realized the connection, and I was really astounded that this was something that was preordained in my journey of faith.
Well, it's funny. Another thing we have in common. So just to explain a little bit to our audience who may not have had the pleasure of encountering a thinker like Jacques Maritain, he's actually more known, at least initially, I thought he was more known for his political philosophy, but he was a French philosopher who converted to Catholicism in around the 1920s. His wife was a poet, Raisa Maritain, and they were exiled from France to the United States because of the Nazis occupying France. And he came to Princeton, and he wrote that book, Creative Intuition in Art and Poetry, here in Princeton, where both you and I are, but we're doing a webinar. But what I loved about it, because as I explained, like you, I was experiencing things and hearing things in my interviews as a sociologist about beauty and suffering, about the importance of kind of our creative capacities. But I was struggling because I didn't think that suffering is not subjective, right? I mean, how we experience or talk about our suffering may be personal, but people are going through really difficult times, and there's some sort of meaning that is teaching us something true about ourselves as humans when we suffer, and we shouldn't turn away from that. And similarly, part of our calling as human beings is to be co-creators with this wonderful nature and material reality we've been given. So I was really struggling with, you also talk about this in your book, that human beings were depicted in their interactions with the natural world in a utilitarian way of almost dominion.
Yes.
And yet I realized that there was something else we do. We co-create, we coexist with objects in the world. We create things, and we give the things that we create a deep sense of meaning.
Yeah.
And every culture does this, right? I had spent time traveling through Latin America and Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Guatemala, Honduras. I wrote a book about Haiti. I went to my mother's country of Cuba. And the way that I connected and got to know people was often through song, music, art, and kind of language of philosophy or even of theology was really in the background. But I thought, where is all of this? Like, sociology doesn't talk about culture as part of our identity as humans. We talk about products of culture. We talk about culture wars.
Yes.
But you talk about culture care. So can you tell me what you mean by this wonderful concept that you came up with? And you have a whole nother book on culture care. Because believe me, audience, this is why this matters. If you're not an artist, join the club. I'm not. I don't paint very well. I don't garden very well. I kill all my plants. It's terrible. But I do draw with my niece, who, as you said, when children are little, they're not judgmental about art. Anything we make is beautiful.
Yes.
So if you're listening tonight, you're going to find out that you are an artist too, even if you don't have paintings on the wall behind you that you did, like Mako.
Yeah, we're artists of the kingdom. Yeah, so right, and there are lots of threads there, but yeah, so I think, you know, part of the journey that culture care arises out of is kind of a reality of an artist caught up in culture wars front lines. And, you know, it was James Davison Hunter, a sociologist, who we coined the term culture wars. And I know him very well. And, you know, he was trying to describe the cultural condition of polarity, especially in America, and realizing that this is an untenable path. And even, you know, when we had conversations about this, you know, we came to the conclusion culture wars rhetoric will lead to real wars. That's why it's so serious. It's, you know, people think, well, culture care, that's nice. Who can argue with that? But it literally is. And we saw it on January 6th. What happens when the rhetoric becomes actualized? And it will be actualized because human beings are people of imagination. If we do not have a sanctified imagination, we become consumers of conspiracy imagination. So that's what happens. That it happens to all of us, actually. You know, we can't just, you know, dismiss these crazy people, you know, storming the Capitol, when all along Christians were, you know, projecting something, explaining it as part of our faith, but it was a projection of a scarcity mindset. That is a huge assumption when you think about it. It's a Darwinian assumption, which you may realize it is the only tenable path to explain what the natural realities. But it is an assumption that human beings make to create a kind of a world which is Darwinian, right? So if you believe in that, if you have faith in that, you will actualize it. Whereas the biblical narrative sets starkly against this mindset of scarcity and zero-sum game. Jesus stands on the hills of Galilee, right, facing the Armageddon Valley, what is known as the Armageddon Valley, which is the most, you know, contested area of Israel, because it is north, west, southeast trade routes, and people living in Nazareth were always under this oppression and persecution, and they had no guarantees that any kind of family values will be respected in the world. And yet Jesus, right, coming out of the world, standing on the western hills of Galilee, which, by the way, is where the abundance is, because of the rain that comes, as opposed to the Syrian side, which is, desert. The western side, olive trees and these wildflowers come up, and Jordan Basin is actually the greatest passageway for migratory birds in the world. People don't know that, and so when Jesus said, "Consider, look at the birds of the air," he wasn't talking about 2 English sparrows flying over you. He was talking about millions of birds flying over you, darkening the skies. He was invoking abundance of creation, and then ushering in the new creation through his sacrifice, through his presence, his voice. And so this was to people who should be fighting culture wars, but they chose instead to follow the Savior, who was promising a ushering in of a new order, new creation, new kingdom, that he will bring through a different means than Darwinian survival. This is a stark contrast to what is happening, and Christians ought to believe that story in the assumption of abundance rather than live in scarcity.
I have to say, this really captivated me at the start of your book. And so I want to stop here for a moment and make sure our audience gets this point, because the way you describe it in your book, which, by the way, I hope all of you order, I put the link to it there. You can find it linked on his website. It's phenomenal. But you make this fundamental point that the story of Christianity is a story of creation, and it's a story of rebelling against that creation, but then a repentance, that rebelling leads to a suffering, which leads to a repentance, which leads to a redemption.
Right.
And then from there, you say that, and this is why all of us are artists, right? That part of being human is we are called to create this new world, and that faith gives us the capacity to co-create and participate in the creation of this new world. I mean, this is astounding, because in some ways, there's a way of thinking like, okay, well, as you describe in your book, a different way of thinking about faith, one could say, will be like, well, faith is going to help me get the most out of this world right here, right now.
Right.
You're saying, no, that's not it, actually. Faith isn't about how do I make the most, how do I be the best utilitarian I can, making the most out of everything I can get. You're actually saying, no, faith is telling us is that part of who we are as humans is we're actually participating in this co-creation of the new order. And when we make things, we are bringing about that new order that Jesus has promised. We look at the world and we see our limitations and we see brokenness, but you have this wonderful quote: when we make things, we invite the abundance of God's world into the reality of scarcity all about us. So we have material limitations, but we can make things that have an imagination of abundance.
Yeah, and my book, Culture Care, and the new book, Art and Faith, Theology of Making, is connected because Culture Care was written to a broader audience. I was doing arts advocacy work, justifying National Endowment for the Arts funding for modern dancers when I was trying to figure out, like, why do we need as a nation to preserve and protect artists who have no utilitarian value whatsoever. Well, we just saw a good argument in the inauguration of Amanda Gorman, 22-year-old, expressing with her poetry something that was fundamental, something that we need, essential reality to our democracy. But, setting that aside, I was trying to make an argument that relied on biblical principles of abundance. So Theology of Making book is really my life work. Every time I lectured in a public sphere, so you can't assume that people have biblical worldview or Christian background, I would write these theological theological precepts for myself, just to think through these philosophical issues, just like Maritain will do with Aquinas, and just think through things that if you're going to argue for some public position, make sure you have your own premises set, right? So I was doing that, and for many years I had volume of notes that I would just type up, and and then there's a lecture, arts lecture, but then behind it there were these theological thoughts, and I relied a lot on at the time I was mentored by Dr. Tim Keller at Redeemer Church in New York, and he would say things like, well, you may have received Jesus as your savior, but have you received Jesus as your creator?
Wow.
Which is a beautiful way of saying what you said. You can get to redemptive, but there's more,
Well, exactly. And I came to this too. I was born and raised Catholic. And so this in some ways is natural to me, but I've taught students of all cultural backgrounds, faith backgrounds, and no faith backgrounds. And part of the reason I became interested in integrating beauty into education is precisely because I think it bridges cultures. Yeah. And it bridges faith, and it bridges people who don't have faith, but have questions about the human condition. Yeah. And so, as you say, right, what's the risk of not talking about beauty and culture? And I like to assign Neil Postman's book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, right? Yeah. Our senses are being stimulated for good or for vice or for nada, for like flattening it out. And so art and beauty, as you said, again, it sounds like we're talking a lot of philosophy here, audience, but art and beauty is not supposed to be purely subjective. It's supposed to be leading us to understanding who we are as human beings.
Yes.
And, Maritain makes this point, but now I understand the origin of your book, because I think, wow, he moves so fluidly between discussing the technique of art, specific objects of art that you've made, paintings you've made, and philosophy and theology. And it's so beautifully interwoven that it's given, I will say this, it's given as a gift, an uplifting gift to me. It lifts my spirits, and it shows me, I think it reveals, right? Good art and good, beautiful writing has a revelatory character.
You should, and going back to Neil Postman, his mentor, Marshall McLuhan, right, was very much, had a very biblical mindset about media, right? He argues that media it is the Holy Spirit, right? And the media, the medium is the message because of how God incarnated, through Jesus' body, something fundamental to our knowledge. And therefore, everyone, whether you're an atheist or you don't believe in God at all, it has to live in that paradigm of medium being a message. And so everything that we think about culture, everything that we think about media, which really doesn't mediate today, it's a very transactional utilitarian thing. But it ought to be something that mediates ultimately. So journalists should be mediating rather than just reporting, because that has fundamental biases that we perhaps don't recognize when we talk about journalism. But all these things, right, are part of the world that we inhabit. And culture and theology and sociology and philosophy, they're all connected because of the fractures that we are experiencing in the world. And we have done so much to dissect and create these new categories. Every minute there's a new denomination and new theology, but we don't have effort to mediate, right? To bring together these elements, to create an intersection and in a way that interdependence can work between disciplines. And so that's kind of part of my defense of even liberal arts, flows out of the biblical conviction of the incarnation, and why it's so important, fundamentally so important for human beings to understand theology, right? So, everybody's kind of a theologian, even if they're not a Christian, or even if they do not acknowledge God, because of the premise that we are living in, and the cultural milieu that has the media world has created. We have to kind of manage that in some way. Otherwise, you become conspiracy theorists, and that shows the weakness of how, especially in evangelical cultures, how the church has not done work, and also invitation to the feast that produces the fruit of the Spirit, quality in our lives and in our communities. It's the opposite. Instead of love, we have hatred. Instead of peace, we have anxiety. And we haven't done well, in our preaching, in our inhabiting our faith into the public context. And that goes back to actually, a lot of things that Neil Postman was warning us against, and amusing ourselves to death. Well, that may lead to storming of the Capitol.
But I think that this point you made, that the human heart longs for peace and human society longs for unity, yet we look at our world and there's fragmentation, and there's anxiety and there's suffering. And this is what got me to start reading and trying to understand beauty and how to integrate it, because as you described, a single painting can move our hearts in ways that we then want to find an explanation for. And in finding that explanation, we come to know who we are as human beings. And although, as I said, as I was born and raised Catholic, I continue to learn more and deepen my understanding. And so one other book that I'm teaching this semester, which I strongly recommend to my audience, as well as to you if you haven't read it. But let me ask you, have you read Joseph Ratzinger's The Spirit of the Liturgy?
I have read parts of it. I have not read the whole thing, but it's an extraordinary document. It's very dense.
Let's get down to concrete, because maybe our attendees can also be thinking, because I'm going to tell you a story about a painting or an image that really moved me, and I'll tie it to the book, because you also wrote about in your book specific images. But this book, The Spirit of the Liturgy by Joseph Ratzinger, it's a story. Basically what he argues is that the liturgy, he's not arguing about how long the procession should be and, where does the altar boy, he's not saying, he's like, why do we worship? What does the Bible tell us about why we worship? What's the place of images? What's the place of music? What's the place of architecture? Just a general review of why do we worship to begin with? And what do we know about how we should worship? But he makes this point in his chapter on images, that images are supposed to help us understand the relationship between the central mysteries of the Christian faith, which are that God became man, the incarnation, that he died for our sins, right? The crucifixion. And third, the resurrection, the new coming, right? The new coming of Christ, the new kingdom, the new world that's brought about. Well, there was an image and an experience that brought home to me the power of this. I was attending a friend's wedding, of all places, in Belgrade, Serbia.
Wow.
And the wedding, she's Serbian Orthodox, and the wedding was on a Sunday afternoon in an Orthodox church. I'm Catholic. I'm like, let me go to a Roman Catholic church in Serbia. Why not? But I was actually feeling really sad, because that day was 6 months to the day from when a young friend of mine, a former student of mine named John Artunian, it was 6 months to the day since he died of cancer at the age of 26. And I was remembering him, and my memory was hurting because I was remembering him being sick. And I emailed a priest and I said, I don't want to go to my friend's wedding and be sad. And he said, Margarita, you have to understand that John is no longer suffering. He is with Christ. And try to picture him with Christ. Well, lo and behold, I walk into this Catholic church in Belgrade, and now I'm reading Ratzinger's book, and it explains it. In Catholic churches in the West, the central image of the church is the crucifixion of Jesus on the cross. Well, here, the central image was the Pantocrator, the resurrected Christ, the King. And I realized that in liturgy, John and I are both together
Yes.
worshiping with Christ the King.
That's right.
But he's already entered into that reality. But I then felt this unity between the living, the visible, and the invisible, right? And that image just captivated me. I couldn't stop looking at it.
Yeah.
And I think this is what Ratzinger is saying, is that images are supposed to not just kind of provoke a feeling, but help us see reality in its depth and in its fullness. So in a way, this is what I want to ask you about now, the part about suffering, the role of beauty in suffering, because suffering is a human reality and we should not turn away from it. But there's a way that you describe of almost, if I could use the word, lean into it, where the suffering can be transformed into the joy of the resurrection.
Yeah. So behind me sits two large paintings, monumental paintings called Walking on Water. And the series began after the 3/11 catastrophe in Japan, where so many villages were washed away with, people, orphan children in grade schools up the hill. And it was unlike anything you would ever want to see. Boats turned upside down on top of houses. And so I began a series, as I have often done. I did a series on Columbine after Columbine High School shootings, and then of course 9/11, where I was unwittingly a ground zero resident 3 blocks away from the towers, and my children became ground zero children. So, I have been responding to these events. And after 3/11, I began a series called Walking on Water. These paintings use pulverized minerals, such as azurite. So they're literally hand pulverized, and then mixed with animal skin hide, and then poured over. I painted these outside because they're so large, and they are kind of like ghost images of creating, if you could imagine, creating landscape of an estuary landscape in front of you. That's because the pigments are very sand-like minerals, and they're flowing in water, and then you're using various means to create imagery out of it. So these literally rivers, streams happen within the painting, and you're trying to intuit this as if to ask, can we walk on water? So my art tends to capture the intuitive response to something tragic or something that is haunting, and yet I do dare to ask that my paintings become an emblem of hope, that there is something about working through that and facing that reality head on can allow an artist to articulate something of the new creation. We have to remember that Jesus, in post-resurrection appearance, still has his wounds, nail marks that is still visible. Thomas was invited to touch them, even though he didn't. He just worshipped. So that reality is both haunting and some there's a staggering promise there, I think, in that whatever we go through in life, in trauma, darkness, struggle, setbacks, those are markers toward the new, if we allow them to be. And any trauma therapy will tell you that, you spend the first 6 months trying to convince the client that trauma is not something that you can simply erase out of your life. Trauma you can't run away from. It makes it worse. You have to understand that it's going to be etched in the body that you inhabit. And once you accept that, then the therapy can begin, And so I spent a lot of time, because I have been traumatized, trying to work through my own trauma through painting. And then I got to a point in writing this book in particular, and reading actually, N.T. Wright's Theology, which is so staggering to think about, his resurrection, that, theology, which actually states that Jesus, it's not just Jesus resurrected, that it's that Jesus stays human in post-resurrection, in new creation. That's the staggering message, which means that our humanity and our brokenness and whatever we suffer on this side of eternity, if we can look through the pain and create something out of that, will define that humanity on the other side of creation. That new creation is a dance that we are invited to, and actually God chooses not to act until his creatures begin to, by faith, create into the fissures of the world. That's like so mind-boggling. But I think about this as an artist all the time, and I intuited it very early on in my journey. And I I'm saying, well, the redemption message is fantastic. I mean, I live by it, I die by it, right? But what happens after the resurrection, right? What is my role? Is it to tell other people about what happened to redeem? Yes, but is that the entire message? What I talk about in the book as plumbing theology. We get these tools to fix the pipe. Every time we go to church and we come home and fix the pipe, and we tell our neighbors and we say, well, come to church with me so you can learn to fix the pipes. And very rarely, right, you hear a message that talks about what's going through the pipes. And, this wine of new creation is flowing back into our lives through the pipes. That's why we're fixing the pipes. But we don't talk about that. And we don't help people to grow imaginatively, like have sanctified imagination and trained ways that we can actualize what God has given us in creation to create into the new creation. So the broken earth is the material through which we create into the future of God's world. But we, that promise, which is hinted in a lot of the mystics, Catholic, theologians of the past, but also in 20th century Jürgen Moltmann and Miroslav Volf, who I have the privilege of conversing with, and of course N.T. Wright and Alan Davis of Duke. These people are talking about this, but we didn't have a way to frame it. And so my book, I hope is one of the ways that we can usher in this thinking about the new creation theology.
It's so beautiful. And, to continue with my story and relate it back to what you're saying, I mean, I loved how in your book, and you just said it now, that so much of just armchair theology, you call it plumbing theology or fix-it theology, like faith's going to help you, I don't know, achieve your next goal, or, be nicer to your friends or something like that, or even more important things. But what you're talking about, you call it like amending that leads to the new. And so if we understand the kind of theology you're talking about, the new creation, we can accept the fact that we are humans and fallen and have a brokenness, and then see that brokenness as not something we have to reject, but actually that those ashes, that brokenness can become the basis actually for building something new. So after I left my, Serbian Catholic church and went to the Serbian Orthodox wedding, I thought, wait a minute, what's going on at marriage? Two individuals are dying to themselves to become something new, right? So a marriage, the banquet, why are we celebrating a marriage? Why are people invited to celebrate? Because there's a dying to oneself that happens to create something new.
And all of the arts are involved in the wedding, right? There's fashion, there's dance, there's music, there's liturgy, there's visual, and spoken words. And that indicates that if in a consummation of the universe, the cosmic wedding to come, if we're preparing ourselves for that, then we better be really good at the arts, right? Because we're wedding planners, and we have to like do our best, right? Who is going to be the musician? Is it, Bach? Is it, Beethoven? Is it, we have to bring the best to the bridegroom. And how is the church doing that right now, to prepare ourselves,
Because American culture is very pragmatic. It's about problem solving.
It's funny. Yeah.
And I like it because they work, and they work on Sundays and they work all the time.
Right.
But you're giving us, I think you're bringing back what you might call kind of a philosophy of, we also have to have a time of leisure and a time of abundance and a time of rejoicing.
Yes.
And so it's not that we don't labor. And look, as human beings, there's going to be a toil involved in labor, and we can't reject that. But where is our economy of abundance and of rejoicing? And it doesn't take a lot of money. It's not material things.
No.
The wedding doesn't have to be expensive. I spent time in Haiti, and people in Haiti know how to rejoice.
Oh yes, that's rich in another way. There's value to plumbing as well, right? So this is not just for artists to usher in the new. It's for people who are pragmatic, who are working every day, blue collar workers. They have just as much invitation. They have the same invitation, and they have the same opportunity to create into the new. It's Brother Lawrence washing his dishes and glorifying God through it. It's all these minute acts of faith that we perhaps don't even talk about or see that can build a new creation as well. So, both beauty and mercy does not make sense in a Darwinian universe, because, beauty is extravagant, and beauty happens despite the Darwinian reality of, survival of the fittest. Mercy is completely counter to our survival mode. Why would you waste your time taking care of the weak, right? That's like the opposite of Darwinian survival skills. But biblical narrative absolutely definitively says that those two things, beauty and mercy, ushers in the new creation. More than the pragmatic, more than the efficient, more than the survival. And so that's why, we need to understand the gospel, the theology, from the perspective of not just from redemptive center at the heart of the gospel is that, but from the creation, invoking of the creation and invoking of new creation at the same time. And that's what Tom Wright argues in his books, which is absolutely liberating for an artist to read and respond to.
Well, that's why I think what you're doing is so important, because ultimately this is a message of hope. Mm-hmm. And the human heart seeks hope. What's the alternative to hope? I mean, I teach a piece on philosophical anthropology by Max Shaler, right?
Yeah.
If you don't believe in the creation redemption, in the creation fall redemption story, then the conclusion is Darwinian.
Yes.
Survival of the fittest. And some of us aren't very fit.
No.
And I mean, that's just the reality, right?
Yeah.
So, and then what then becomes wrong with just letting a lot of people die? I mean, why stop it? So, but mercy is the opposite of that. Mercy is abundant love, even for those who don't seem on a Darwinian scale to be fit, right? Yeah. Why is this a message of hope for people who are skeptical that, there's no truth in anything anymore, right? Everything is purely an impression. Everything is purely a feeling. Everything is a response to an environment. And you're saying, kind of like Augustine, oh, beauty ever ancient and ever new. Wait a minute. Don't be skeptical. Material reality has its brokenness. It has its problems. Yeah. But we don't have to be skeptics, and we don't have to be nihilists who deny meaning and order. No. Yeah. There is order. And there is meaning to the universe. And the human heart, universally, I believe, wants to hear this, because the alternatives are that the ultimate reality is darkness and is death. Mm-hmm. And Christianity, I think, gives a way to look at darkness and death
Mhm.
and other systems of faith too, right? Any system
Yeah.
of faith that has this creation redemption story says, no. We can look at the darkness, but
Yeah.
bring out a deeper reality that then lets us, as you described, this is why we're all called to be artists. Because once you have this insight, wait a minute, what I
Mhm.
do in my everyday life and what I'm making is actually transforming reality.
Yeah, and this can happen in outside the church as well as inside the church. I always say that the Holy Spirit doesn't read labels. Just because you call yourself a Christian plumber, it doesn't make you a good plumber. And it's not like the Holy Spirit, says, "Oh, that's a Christian church, so I'm going to go there." I think this is an area that will require more developing and conversation. But the biblical narrative is all about all of creation coming afoot, coming to the cross, right? And so Isaiah 60, ship of Tarshish is coming in with pagan kings bringing the world's treasures into New Jerusalem. And a lot of times in Christendom, we don't have a way to understand or even appreciate something that is done in other cultures or what we know as pagan cultures or whatever. Yet there's a lot of the voice of the Holy Spirit that's speaking through nature, speaking through people who are not believers, art that is done by people who are atheists, and anarchists, and these are actually evidences of God's grace. God's grace is flowing through all of us by God's wisdom. God did not just pour His grace into Christians, and so we can appreciate the world and look with new creation eyes. Now, it's the only thing that Christians have been given the task to do that non-Christians cannot is first of all to understand the particular grace, right, that we have in Christ, that we are new creation, and we are able to gain a eyesight of faith that can look at a non-believer's work and say, do you realize that you are tapping into the new creation? Non-Christian world is skeptical. It's certainly dark. It is prosecutorial because it is determined to survive, right? But if you can at least persuade somebody who is an atheist to actually consider that beauty and mercy has more enduring value than self-expression, then only a Christian can say that, because that's the world that we believe in. And we can say, Christ is here, the Spirit is here, despite the fact that you choose not to believe in that world. And that is also an extension of grace that Christians need to learn in culture, because we need to bring grace into culture. And not to bring judgment, the kind of judgment that Christians are known for.
Well, I'm so delighted that you have written this book. I'm going to say a few more things, but please feel free to submit questions through the Q&A button. We're going to now turn to some questions from the audience, but I will say that part of the reason I was so excited to host you tonight is that I think your book and your art and your life illustrate what you have just said, that one can stand in a particular culture and tradition, but also transcend that.
Yeah.
And so from your particularity, you describe this in the book very beautifully, some of the Japanese techniques that you have, you're bringing those techniques into American culture and bridging, right? Your whole life is really in some ways about bridging. You didn't grow up from a Christian background, but you became a Christian. You dialogue with people who aren't, but you come as yourself in your particular history. Yeah. But the art that you do and the philosophy and the theology you have is universal in the sense that it's open to anybody who's exploring these fundamental questions, which is what Scala is really all about, that education should be giving us the means to know the world rationally, poetically, scientifically, in all these different ways with an openness to the truth that comes from different disciplines and from different cultures, but with the firm conviction that Christians have that there is a unity to all of these.
Integration. Yeah.
Yes.
Anytime you're integrating, there's God in it. You know?
So, hey, it makes sense. I can have the unifying framework, but
Yeah.
then that allows me to perceive and to appreciate the beauty, which frankly, a skeptical point of view, just, well, all perspectives are just somebody's perspective. And well, how do they integrate then? What makes them,
Right.
how do they come together? So
And
I wondered, while we have some questions coming in from the audience, I wondered, a common question you get, and this is addressed in the Ratzinger book, at what point can art become a kind of idolatry? When does art,
yeah.
so how would you answer that?
So idol, is a good thing that has become an only thing, right? So it's not like just because something becomes an idol that the origin of that is bad or to be rejected. In fact, it's the opposite. Anytime you have an idol, that means that it began, the origin was something that is fundamentally good, that a gift of God that was given to us: money, sex, all those things, health, family, art. All these things are good gifts of God that we have twisted into our, determined particularities and wanted to control that and become gods ourselves, right? So we can control the future. So all we have to do is twist it back, and melt the golden calf and create the tabernacle of Moses. And that is the biblical narrative. That is what happens. And so God is looking at this and saying, look at all these idols. Calvin said we're idol factories. But that points at the fundamental reality of God's grace and gifting in the world. So those are signposts, and you can go, look at every idol that exists, including political idol, which creates culture wars, including, everything that, industrial efficiency idol, determined to destroy the earth. And, these have origins that we have to trace back and reinterpret in light of good stewardship and in light of love. Right. So love is the ultimate trigger and ultimate way that we can get back, toward a proper understanding of our gifts. And so, it doesn't matter if you believe in God or not. Do you believe in love? That's even the bigger question, more fundamental question. And if you believe in love, then how do you justify that? Other than just loving somebody for your own sake, how do you justify unconditional love of giving away yourself, which you noted, every wedding is beautiful because of that. Our hearts can't explain that apart from the possibility, right? And so I always challenge people who are skeptics to say, well, do you believe in love? And I say, I'm not sure, And I say, do you believe that it might exist, like 10%, like of the universe may have some kind of love? And they say, I don't believe that, right? So I said, do you think 1%? What about 1%? And they said, maybe, And so I say, okay, so let's say there was 0.001% possibility of pure love existing in the universe. Do you believe that? And they said, I guess I do, right? And I say, well, there it is. If there's a 0.001% of love, pure love existing in the universe, if that is possible, shouldn't we be spending everything we have to find that love? And if that's the case, if you agree with that statement, then every education should be about that, right? We should be asking all the questions, the sciences, the arts, the engineering, the marketing, school of management. Everybody should be asking that simple question. How do we pursue that possibility? You don't even have to believe in it, even though if you say that exists, you have to believe in it. But you don't even have to assent to it. All you have to do is make that step. This is my Pascal's argument for it. Or just step into the assumption of what that question will give you today. And then we can start developing that into something more tangible in terms of disciplines, in terms of integration, because integration cannot happen without that possibility of love existing. It will be all scattered. So, that to me is the basis of liberal arts education. That to me is why the arts are fundamental to all that we do. And how we can access even people who may not believe in God to journey into this journey into the new.
Well, it's like you read my mind because you tied together a couple of other questions. But let me just say, folks, you heard that on Scala's webinar tonight.
Yes.
Because that was so beautifully said. And I don't think it was exactly said that way in your book. But let me try to repeat it and tie it to the larger point you're making, because it was so beautiful. What I heard you saying in response to this question, when do we have idolatry? And you said, well, of course, we can go too far sometimes. But the answer to idolatry is not to reject the idea of art or images, but it is to maybe purify it.
Yeah.
Because we need art, because we're humans, and we're humans made with a heart that wants to love and that wants to enter into this abundant love.
Yes.
And so it's not so much the question of idolatry is when images are being used in the wrong way. And I think going back to the idea of the spirit of images is what we're talking about here tonight. The spirit of why we even have art and painting and beauty, because it teaches the human heart the most important thing the human heart needs to know, that love is infinite.
Yes.
And when you have grasped, as you said, that maybe that wager of 0.001% is true,
Yes.
that there's such a thing as infinite love,
Yeah.
it opens up all kinds of vistas. And so those paintings behind you right now, like I can't necessarily put words on what that makes me think or feel, but it's shaping how I understand myself in relationship to the world. And again, we're talking about all these philosophers and Maritain and all this, but look, the reason fine art, painting, beauty, music belongs in every curriculum, and why I believe in a liberal arts curriculum, is because those things, the fine arts, open up our minds and teach us about love. So imagine a life without beauty,
Yes,
right? And
right.
in fact, what have totalitarian communist societies done?
That's right.
They squashed beauty.
Yeah.
And when they squash beauty, they squash humanity. So one of the questions from Henry Burt, who's very involved with Scala, he's a student at Princeton Theological Seminary, is how do we bring this into education? I mean, liberal arts education, including beauty, but you've also, so you just eloquently answered that, but I also know that you have gone to high schools and you've given talks in boys' high schools about painting. Right. Now, how did that go?
So the best way to illustrate the nature of, why we need the arts is go into a boys' high school and tell them, a very skeptical group, right? Like, why are we listening to an artist? I say, well, you guys need the arts because if you're going to go on a date, you have to have the arts. You have to be thinking about beauty. You cannot like invite somebody on a date and say, we're going to do accounting. Maybe you can with an accountant. I don't know. Maybe you can do plumbing with a plumber. But you really have to know, like, at least a movie, at least music, at least, maybe you can invite, your potential partner to a museum, that's really important. So for that reason alone, you should be interested in the arts, and I get all the attention that way. Is that
right? That's true. Well, maybe it's a way of teaching young men, how to flirt with a woman. I had a man tell me the other day that a woman told him that one time a guy was trying to flirt with her, and the only thing he could come up with was, "You have really beautiful eyeballs." So maybe you can tell high school boys that if they know something about art, they'll be able to say, your eyes are beautiful as the ocean waves on a windy afternoon or something.
Or your eyes are beautiful as a Da Vinci's painting, or I mean there are creative ways that you can spin that.
But no, that's but no, in all seriousness, Scala hosts a lot of, events on education and liberal arts education. And we also have a student in my class, Sean Pomery, who's asking a question. Look, let's face it, education policy and policy in general is really utilitarian. And everything is about producing and consuming. Healthcare, education, theology, fix-it theology, as you called it. Like, how do you really sell this vision?
Well, you don't have to sell it, because it's fundamental to who we are, and everything has become transactional. But the thing about it is that when you really look at the possibility of integration happening in anybody, any human being, that human formation is the goal of education. It's not information like that you can spit out. And because those traditionally were very attractive ways, because they get you jobs, converging skills is what you need to get a job, right? So engineering and so forth. But now, I talked to the dean of engineering at Buckner University, and he says, I can't recruit a student in the same way, because if I teach a freshman how to have these converging skills in order to be able to build a bridge when they graduate, those are going to be obsolete by the time they graduate, because machines can do it better. The data mining algorithm is going to do that converging tasks, as we've seen, that you cannot beat a machine playing chess, because there's one outcome, somebody wins, and machine's going to be able to do it better. So he has to think about recruiting students, engineering students, who are divergent thinkers, who ask not how to build a new bridge, but they ask, what is a bridge?
Well, that's great. I actually, to build on what you're saying, I actually did a project with Maria Garlock at Princeton's civil engineering program. And we went with a couple of other engineering professors to Italy on a trip on engineering and beauty. And I had this discussion with these professors of engineering who really believe in integrating engineering and beauty. How do you sell this to the engineering guild and to, precisely what you said, that what actually drives science isn't technology. It's the human creativity that has the capacity to imagine something, which then you develop the science and the engineering to bring into being, right? So we've almost forgotten that Einstein, was an inventor. The best scientists are inventors, and they have these intuitions about what could be in the material world. And this is where you get the best science and engineering. Right. And not that you don't need the scientific method or utilitarianism, but we can't have an education system that's purely based on that. Now one other question that's coming in a different direction, which I hadn't gotten a chance to ask you, so I'll thank Alex for bringing this up. Alex Hoshino, he would like to know this message of Christianity and love, which you've told us how you've come to it through your vocation as a painter and your journey. How do you speak to Japanese audiences about this, and what kind of reception do you get from your own Japanese?
Well, I wrote a whole book about it. So Silence and Beauty is about that journey. but I think certainly it's not easy to speak to a culture that has persecuted Christians for centuries, to speak about Christ. But it's just as difficult in the art world. In fact, I feel like I was trained in Egypt to create something beautiful in the nomadic reality of worshiping God in the desert, and I am able to speak to my contemporaries who are very skeptical about faith issues in general, and persuade them to consider the possibility of faith, because I was in Japan when I came to faith, and I had to every day, study and defend my faith in the context of what turns out to be what I say in my book is that Japan is not a pagan culture; it is a hidden Christian culture. There are plenty of evidences that you can exegete from culture that allows me to say that. So how do you trace those steps? And in fact, I think Japan is the key culture to unlock the gospel for the Great Commission fulfillment, because of the refined ways that they have persecuted only Christians for 250 years. So they have embedded by mirror image of what they persecuted is that they had to understand Christianity really well to persecute Christians. So that means that embedded in culture is something fundamental, the key to unlock all cultures and the gospel, I think, for us to learn from, certainly, and to communicate. And certainly that this is critical because our culture, American culture, has in terms of imagination, it's not from the West, it's from the Japanese, it's from the animations that the young people have gained access to the back door of imagination. So that means that if you want to speak to the younger generation, you have to understand Japan in order to get to their hearts. and that is proven over and over in various ways. Everything from technology, everything from the way they value nature and community. They're becoming Japanese in a sense. And Japan is losing their Japanness. The world is gaining in their Japaneseness. So this is really important to understand actually 16th and 17th century Japan in order to get access to our youth generation. That's a strange statement to make, but I believe that's true culturally.
I would never have guessed you would answer that way, and it's going to provoke a lot of thinking on me. But I do share an affinity, perhaps from a different cultural perspective, of understanding how and when and why Christianity has been persecuted. Because as I mentioned, my mother is from Cuba. And what I think people don't realize was how violent the Cuban Revolution was. And I was actually just rereading my journals from my trip to Cuba with my mother in 1999. And would you believe that after 45 years, we show up in a little village and the church had been turned into a movie theater. But you know what? You know what somebody kept in their backyard for 45 years? The stained glass windows. They went and pulled them out. And the shock on my mother's face. And when we told our family, they couldn't believe it. So these people had this hope, and it just, what's going on? I also just watched on television during COVID, Dr. Zhivago, and I'm fascinated by Russian Orthodoxy and Armenian Orthodoxy and Serbian Orthodoxies. I said, well, why did the Soviets persecute beauty so much? Why did they have to, what was it? So I never thought of it this way, but why is the cultural message, in particular of Christianity, the beauty, why is that so threatening to people in power? And I think the Japanese case, you're right, is a wonderful case to understand why is Christianity threatening to the powerful?
Yeah, and how artists respond, and like artists like Kazimir Malevich, who is a Russian Orthodox artist, oppressed and persecuted, created a minimalist abstract painting because he wasn't allowed to create icons, and that became literally Museum of Modern Art was built on Malevich's paintings because Princeton graduate. What's his name? He founded the Museum of Modern Art, found Malevich in Paris, and among other artists like Picasso and Braque, but Alfred Barr brought those paintings to New York, created a museum dedicating to these minimalistic white paintings that somehow you're supposed to put it in a corner of the room, not central, as it is today. He instructed Alfred Barr to put it in the corner because that was the Orthodox way of putting an icon in every room, and that began the modern art movement. So there it is again, the stained glass windows, right, that are hidden behind the church, which is a cinema. And which I find it beautiful because I'm part of a group, Theology of Film, right? It's perhaps the most transcendent experience that a non-Christian will experience. At least when we were able to go to the theater, what do? You buy popcorn, you buy Pepsi, right? And that's your communion. And you have these transcendent things that you cannot justify with your worldview. And you feel something and you can't explain this. And you go out, watching Star Wars or whatever, and you go out and you say, why did I feel that way? And that's because there's a theological interaction. There's a spirit's interaction in that cinema. We may be able to turn it into cinema, but you can't stop the spirit from speaking.
And that's why culture and art, it can be threatening because
that's right.
Because it by definition transcends the material reality, and it transcends the power structures because it's communicating a message about a deeper reality. And this is what Maritain expresses philosophically so well, right? That objects we make in the world communicate to the soul a reality about the nature of who God is. And even if we don't have the language for that, those intuitions that you're talking about can lead people to then, create things or search for the truth. And so when you want to control somebody, you have to cut them off from these things that spark their intuition and their creativity. You have to put them as it is in kind of a box where you're really in Plato's cave. Like there's nothing outside. Like you're in that bubble.
That's
and
right.
So to begin to wind down, we're doing this at the end of, I said at the end, we don't know when this is going to end. I've been teaching from home since March last year, and I think there's a lot of difficult things that have happened in the world and in people's lives, but talking to you has been so life-giving, and reading your book and teaching Ratzinger's Spirit of the Liturgy and creative intuition in art and poetry. And I am convinced that out of the brokenness that we are seeing in so many places, we are going to see imaginative, creative solutions, because the human heart is made for hope, and it's made for love, and it's made for unity. And right now we're just being bombarded with images of our fragmentation. And all I want to do is hold out to the audience and say, kind of like I would say when people would talk, because I worked in Haiti, people say, oh, there's so much poverty in Haiti. There's so much, this. I said, look, everything bad you've ever heard is true, but you got to see the beauty there. And there's an abundant beauty. So yes, these are fragmented, difficult times, but I hope that this talk tonight and these books and future webinars are going to help people not create the beauty, perceive the beauty that's reaching out to
beholding.
And this is why I founded Scala, and it's been such a pleasure to have you. Scala's mission, as you said, is on liberal arts education. We actually have a forthcoming book called The Love of Learning. The love of the liberal arts, the explosive, the passion back into learning. And I want to thank the co-sponsors, the Catholic Studies program at St. Thomas University, in the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul. Thank all of our attendees, all of our sponsors, the people who generously contribute out of their personal funds to make these webinars happen. I'm so grateful for your support. We will be making this video available to a public because there was so much here that was so rich. And if I could just please recommend you check out Makoto Fujimura's website, his book on art and faith, his other books, the other resources, which we have been putting in the chat box. And please, I hope this talk, if it's gone over your head, I hope you understand that it's practical in the sense that you are meant to be whoever you are, whatever your background, whatever your faith is, you are meant to enter into this amazing process of co-creation and bringing about the new reality, the new world that we're all longing for in the depths of our hearts.
Amen.